Hi, welcome to Sociological Lens. I am Dr. Dilsora Fozilova, and this is a short video lecture on the politics of extremism, terrorism, and dissent. These terms are not just theoretical constructs, they are powerful tools of political discourse, deeply interwoven with societal structures, state narratives, and global dynamics. Their usage shapes how we perceive actions, ideologies, and movements, whether we see them as threats to stability or as carriers for justice. Extremism is often associated with ideologies that challenge societal norms and exist on the fringes, while terrorism focuses on acts of violence designated or, or designed to instill fear and achieve political goals. Dissent, in contrast, involves opposing or challenging dominant power structures. Depending on the context and narrative framing, dissent can sometimes blur into the realms of extremism or terrorism, highlighting the complexity of these terms. These concepts are interconnected because they all engage with power, how it is exercised, challenged, and defended. The boundaries between them are fluid, and how they are labeled often depends on who holds the authority to define them. For instance, what one group may call dissent, another might label extremism or even terrorism. In this lecture, we will first unpack the politics of extremism, terrorism, and dissent in individual concepts. Then we will explore their intersections, examining how movements or actions can shift between these categories. By understanding these terms together, we gain a deeper insight into how power operates through labeling, controlling, and responding to resistance, violence, and or ideological divergence. So, what is politics of extremism? The politics of extremism refers to the way extreme ideologies and behaviors are defined, managed, and manipulated within political context. Extremism generally describes beliefs or actions that deviate significantly from the mainstream societal norms, often perceived as dangerous or threatening to the existing social or political order. And we need to remind ourselves that social norms are socially constructed. Therefore, extremism or extremist ideas or norms are also socially constructed. Extremist ideologies may manifest across the political spectrum, encompassing for left, for right, religious, or single issue movements. What is considered extremist, however, depends on the cultural and political context, as social norms vary widely across regions and time periods and cultures and societies. In many cases, extremism is characterized by a rejection of compromise and an unwavering commitment to particular ideology. Historical examples include far right ideologies like fascism in the 20th century Europe, or far left movements like Maoism. Contemporary cases include groups such as the Islamic State, ISIS, which seeks to establish a religiously defined state, or far right white nationalist movements in various countries. In these contexts, extremism often leverages feelings of alienation, marginalization, or perceived threats to identity or values to recruit and mobilize supporters. The drivers of extremism are multifaceted. They can be all different kinds: economic inequality, political corruption, social isolation, or rapid cultural changes can all create fertile ground for extremist ideologies. In some cases, specific triggers or specific triggering events such as wars, terrorist attacks, or high profile injustices can catalyze extremist movements. Additionally, advancements in technology, the rise of social media have an earlier for the impact or easier for extremist ideas to spread or recruit followers and coordinate actions across various borders. Extremism significantly impacts politics, often destabilizing governments and polarizing societies. Extremist rhetoric can influence mainstream political discourse, pushing political parties or policymakers towards more radical positions. At the same time, governments may respond to extremism with repressive measures such as surveillance, censorship, or restrictions on civil liberties, which can in turn fuel further extremism. For instance, anti extremism policies like the Patriot Act in the USA after 9/11 sought to curb terrorism, but also raised concerns about individual freedoms and government overreact. It is crucial to differentiate extremism from terrorism, which we're going to talk about terrorism in the next slide. While extremism focuses on ideologies and beliefs that deviate from the norm, the terrorism refers to specific acts of violence aimed to instilling fear in achieving political goals. Not all extremists resort to violence, and not all acts of terrorism stem from extremist beliefs. For example, an extremist environmental group might advocate radical measures to protect the planet without engaging in violence, whereas terrorism explicitly uses violence as a strategy. This distinction is crucial for understanding how societies and governments respond to this phenomena and their political implications. In summary, politics of extremism reveals the tensions between ideological divergence and societal stability. Understanding its drivers and impacts is essential for understanding the root causes and consequences of extremism in contemporary landscapes. Now, politics of terrorism, on the other hand, encompasses the ways in which terrorism is understood, framed, and addresses within political systems. Terrorism is typically defined as a use of violence or the threat of violence to instill fear and achieve political, ideological, and religious goals. This deliberate targeting of civilians, symbolic locations, or government institutions distinguishes terrorism from other forms of violence. However, the distinction of terrorism are often contested and politically charged, as groups labeled terrorists by one entity might be considered freedom fighters by another. This ambiguity reflects the power dynamics inherent in how terrorism is framed and understood. Terrorism emerges in various contexts, often as a response to perceived oppression, occupation, or exclusion. It is employed as a strategy by non-state actors, insurgent groups, and in some cases, states themselves. That's called state-sponsored terrorism. The causes of terrorism are complex, including historical grievances, socioeconomic inequality, political instability, and ideological radicalization. For example, the rise of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS was fueled by a combination of foreign interventions, religious instability, and ideological propaganda. Understanding the motivations and root causes of terrorism is essential for developing effective responses that addresses not only the acts of violence, but also the conditions that enable them. There are global and regional trends of politics of terrorism. Terrorism is a global phenomenon, but its prevalence and forms vary across regions. In the Middle East, terrorism has often been tied to conflicts over territory, religiosity or religious identity, and politics of power or political power. In South Asia, groups like the Taliban have combined terrorism with insurgency tactics in struggles over governance. In Europe and North America, far-right extremism and lone wolf attacks have become significant concerns alongside ongoing threats from jihadist organizations. Globalization and technological advancements, particularly the rise of internet and social media, have allowed terrorist groups to disseminate propaganda, recruit members, and coordinate attacks across various borders, and creating a more interconnected threat landscape. And the counterterrorism and impact on politics. Counterterrorism refers to the strategies and actions taken by governments and international bodies to prevent, combat, and mitigate the effects of terrorism. These strategies range from military interventions and intelligence operations to de-radicalization programs and international cooperation. For instance, the US-led war on terror involved military campaigns in Afghanistan, in Iraq, intelligence sharing among allies, and measures to disrupt terrorist financing. However, counterterrorism efforts often face significant challenges, including balancing security needs with human rights. Avoiding unintended civilian harm and addressing the ideological roots of terrorism. Overly aggressive and indiscriminate counterterrorism policies can backfire, exasperate grievances, and fueling further radicalization. Impact on politics. Terrorism profoundly influences political systems, often reshaping priorities in government structures. In the wake of major terrorist attacks, governments may implement sweeping changes to domestic policies, such as increasing surveillance, tightening border control, or passing anti-terrorism legislation. While these measures aim to enhance security, they can also lead to erosion of civil liberties and democratic norms. Politically, terrorism is often used as a tool to justify authoritarian or suppress dissent. For example, governments may label opposition groups as terrorists to delegitimize them and justify repressive actions. On a global scale, terrorism has prompted the formation of international coalitions and agreements aiming at combating the threat highlighted in the impact of diplomatic relations and global governance. And while terrorism and extremism are closely related, They are distinct phenomena. Extremism pertains to ideologies or beliefs that deviate from mainstream norms, whereas terrorism involves the use of violence to achieve specific political goals. Not all extremists resort to terrorism, and not all terrorists' acts stem from extremist ideologies. Understanding this distinction is crucial for crafting nuanced policies that address the ideological, social, and political dimensions of both issues. So, the politics of terrorism underscores the complex interplay between violence, ideology, and governance. By understanding the motivations, global trends, and impacts of terrorism, societies can develop more effective strategies to address this persistent threat while safeguarding democratic principles and human rights movements. Then the politics of dissent. Dissent refers to the act of expressing opposition or disagreement with established authority, prevailing norms, or dominant ideologies. It is a fundamental aspect of democratic societies where individuals and groups have a right to challenge power structures, advocate for change, and highlight injustices. Dissent can take many forms, including protests, boycotts, petitions, art, or civil disobedience. Unlike terrorism and extremism, dissent does not inherently involve violence or radical ideologies. Instead, it is often grounded in principles of dialogue, reform, or advocacy. However, how dissent is perceived and treated varies significantly depending on the political or social context. There's a big difference between extremism and terrorism and dissent, but there are just overlapping part of them. While dissent, extremism, and terrorism may intersect, they differ in purpose, methods, and also societal impact. Dissent focuses on questioning or opposing authority, often through nonviolent means and with a legal or moral frameworks. Extremism, on the other hand, as we mentioned already, is characterized by ideological rigidity and the rejection of pluralism, which may or may not lead to violence. Terrorism represents the most extreme manifestation where violence is deliberately used to instill fear and achieve political goals. So these distinctions are crucial but often blurred in political discourse. Governments and authorities sometimes conflate dissent with extremism or terrorism to delegitimate opposition and justify repressive actions or policies. For example, peaceful protests might be labeled as extremist or subversive to silence dissenting voices. In the contemporary political landscape, dissent plays a crucial role in shaping social movements and challenging systemic inequalities. Global protests, such as those advocating for climate justice, racial inequality, racial equality, or women's rights, illustrate how dissent can mobilize diverse groups and bring attention to pressing issues. Social media and digital reforms have amplified the reach of dissent, allowing individuals to organize, share ideas, and challenge narratives on global scale. However, this also led to increased surveillance and crackdowns on dissent in authoritarian regimes and even democratic regimes. In some contexts, dissent becomes lifeline for marginalized groups whose voices are excluded from mainstream political processes. Movements like Black Lives Matter, Fridays for Future, and anti-corruption protests in countries like Russia or Lebanon, highlight how dissent can catalyze societal change and hold power to account. At the same time, dissent is not immune to cooptation, where powerful actors absorb or neutralize opposition by superficially addressing demands without enacting substantive change. So the politics of dissent underscores the importance of creating spaces where opposition can be expressed without fear and repression. Distinguishing dissent from extremism and terrorism is vital for preserving democratic principles and ensuring that opposition to authority remains a legitimate and constructive part of political discourse. The face of increasing polarization in authoritarianism, fostering a culture of dissent remains essential for challenging inequalities, inspiring innovation, and driving societal progress. So, what are the intersections between these three? So, the themes of extremism, terrorism, and dissent are deeply interconnected, often blurring into one another, depending on perspective, context, and state narratives. These concepts share a common thread in how they challenge, uphold, or respond to power and control within societies. The boundaries between them are fluid, shaped by who defines them and for what purpose. This interconnectedness reflects the broader dynamics of state power, globalization, and technology, which significantly influence how this phenomenon manifests and are perceived. The thin line between extremism, terrorism, and dissent are those one of the most striking aspects of these themes is the thin and often politically manipulated line that separates them. A peaceful dissenting movement can be reframed as extremism if it challenges entrenched power structures too forcefully. In some cases, acts of dissent are labeled as terrorism to delegitimize and suppress them entirely. For instance, protests against authoritarian governments may be portrayed as violent uprisals or justify crackdowns. This fluidity demonstrates how the categorization of these acts often depends more on the lens of power than on the actions themselves. The states play an important role in defending and managing the boundaries between dissent, extremism, and terrorism. Governments wield these terms to maintain control and suppress challenges to their authority. In some cases, dissent is criminalized or conflated with extremism to silence opposition, as seen in the arrests of journalists, activists, and protesters under anti-terrorism law. Conversely, states also respond to genuine threat of terrorism and extremism by employing counterterrorism measures, which can further blur the lines of these tools or misuses to target legitimate dissent. The politics of labeling then reveals the underlying struggle between authority and the people's right to question or resist it. Globalization and technology. Globalization and advancement in technology have both expanded and complicated the dynamics between extremism, terrorism, and dissent. On the one hand, technology has the democratized access to information and amplified dissenting voices. Movements such as the Arab Spring and the climate justice protests leveraged digital platforms or organize, mobilize, and draw international attention. On the other hand, though, extremist ideologies and terrorist networks have also exploited these technologies, using them to recruit, spread propaganda, and coordinate attacks. So the technology is kind of like a double-edged sword in this case. Globalization has interconnected societies, making the impact of this phenomena ripple beyond borders. A protest in one country can inspire movements worldwide, while extremism and terrorism are increasingly transnational, requiring coordination and or coordinated international responses. This interconnectedness highlights how technology and globalization serve as double-edged sword, both empowering and complicating the politics of dissent, extremism, and terrorism. So in short, the interconnection between these themes underscores the importance of crucial analysis in understanding how power operates in defining and responding to dissent, extremism, and terrorism. The thin line between this phenomena is not fixed, not solid, but shaped by societal values, state interests, and global influences. As technology and globalization continue to evolve, so will the ways these themes interact, challenging societies to strike a balance between maintaining security, respecting dissent, and addressing the root causes of extremism and terrorism. So this is a short lecture explaining these three different terms that interconnect extremism, terrorism, and dissent. And I hope you liked it. I will talk to you in our next lecture.